So looking at Woodrow Wilson's role in the peace settlement after World War I, Wilson's role in the peace settlement must be evaluated in two parts. His goals, a fair and just peace for all nations of the world, including the Germans. To keep the peace, Wilson wanted to establish an international political organization, the League of Nations. His failures we could sum up in two parts: home and overseas. We'll take a look at those through this learning objective. When the war ended, the world looked with awe and expectation to one person, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. Wilson enjoyed universal prestige. Victors vanquished and neutrals admitted that America's intervention had decided the conflict. Everywhere, people who had been long tried and confused were stirred by Wilson's thrilling language in favor of a higher cause, of a great concert of right in which peace would be forever secure and the world itself at last free of the tyranny of war and the horror of war. This was a war thought to end all wars. It was so horrific and so awful. The carnage was unbelievable. Wilson was widely acclaimed as the man who would lead civilization out of its wasteland. But at the end of the war, nationalists of one sort or another were ruling both the victorious nations of the West and the new enlarged states that were springing up in Eastern Europe. As we shall soon see, it will be the strong nationalistic feeling that will destroy President Wilson's appeal for a fair and just peace with Germany. And again, that's also going to lead to World War II later on. The nationalists, Lloyd George and Clemenceau of France, altered Wilson's appeal, gradually molding it and interpreting it in directions that the president had never intended. So looking at Wilson's goals, in January 1918, Wilson enunciated his famous 14 points as the basis of a lasting peace. In his blueprint for peace, Wilson had declared that the war was, quote, a war for freedom and justice and self-government amongst all the nations of the world, a war to make the world safe for the people who live upon it and have made it their own, the German people themselves included, unquote. With this speech, Wilson made himself a new kind of world leader, representing not just wealth and power, but morality and justice, as millions of men and women at home and abroad flocked to his standard, and really pushed him for his standard as well. It was on the basis of the 14 points the Germans agreed to end the war. So this is what will be one of the controversies at the end of the war, is that a lot of this stuff is going to be abandoned once the peace conference gets underway. But as you can see, the 14 points are laid out here. No more secret agreements or open covenants openly arrived at. Free navigation of all seas, an end to all economic barriers between countries, countries to reduce weapon numbers, all decisions regarding the colonies should be impartial, yeah right. The German army is to be removed from Russia. Russia should be left to develop its own political setup. Yeah, that would be another thing that would be abandoned. Belgium should be independent like before the war. France should be fully liberated. All Italians are to be allowed to live in Italy. Italy's borders are to be along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. Self-determination should be allowed for all those living in Austria-Hungary. Self-determination and guarantees of independence should be allowed for the Balkan states. The Turkish people should be governed by the Turkish government. Non-Turks in the old Turkish Empire should govern themselves. An independent Poland should be created, which should have access to the sea. And finally, a League of Nations should be set up to guarantee the political and territorial independence of all states. Nearly all of Wilson's points dealt with political, military, or territorial issues. The only economic proposal in the whole list was the vague statement on the removal of trade barriers. This lack of consideration for the economic problems which plagued Europe after the war is considered to be the major weakness of Wilson's 14 points and the Peace of Paris. And so much like the Peace of Paris and the shortcomings of the 14 points and the shortcomings of Wilson's leadership and the shortcomings of French leadership and English leadership, the lack of economic base to the peace helped prepare Europe for, unfortunately, World War II. Wilson's second goal was to create the League of Nations. So the League would be a permanent international body in which all nations, without sacrificing their sovereignty, should meet together to discuss and settle disputes, each promising not to resort to war. And this would be the forerunner of the United Nations, which would be developed after World War II. Few European statesmen had any confidence in such a league, but they yielded to Wilson, and the Charter of the League of Nations was written into the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty with Germany. In return, Wilson had to make concessions to Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Orlando, and the Japanese. He was obliged to compromise the idealism of the 14 points. Wilson believed that if a League of Nations was established and operating, faults in the treaty would be corrected at leisure by international discussion later on. So on to Wilson's failures at home. Wilson's failures, beginning with his failures at home. The American delegation was headed by Wilson himself, since he was convinced that he alone could persuade the Allies to make the sort of peace he envisioned. Wilson knew that the French and the British had still more, the Italians had their own national aims, which they were completely unwilling to sacrifice to the wider goals of a just peace. Another major reason for World War II. Wilson purposely chose a weak delegation as he expected to compose the treaty himself. Wilson wanted to fight for his brainchild, the League of Nations. Wilson ignored protocol of having the opposition party represented. However, he had only one Republican on the 5-person peace delegation, and that choice was an epic failure on Wilson's part. That it would cost him the ratification of the treaty in the Senate and the Senate's approval of the League of Nations itself. So even though the United States came up with the idea of the League of Nations, the United States would never participate in the League of Nations. The logical Republican, Henry Cabot Lodge, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but since he and Wilson were political enemies, he was not appointed. When the treaty and the League came to the floor of the Senate for ratification, Lodge felt the Republican Party was entitled to more than 20% representation, and the interest of the country, as viewed by the party, was not represented. So it was voted down. Wilson's second failure came from overseas in negotiation of the peace settlement. Wilson had been criticized because it is said he failed to understand that much of Europe did not have the type of society that would support the democratic settlement he advocated. Wilson failed to take into consideration the position of the alien minorities living in many of the new Eastern European nations. He also failed to understand the emotional attitude of most Europeans, the hateful feelings caused by the war. As Americans was further removed, it was easier for it to forgive and forget. But for people living through that war, it was definitely not. Wilson's final failure was that his 14 points, as discussed earlier, did not contain an economic solution for peace. So the peace settlement was held in Paris, Peace of Paris, January through May of 1919 it was held. President Wilson and many others felt the World War should end in a new type of treaty. The absolute carnage and the horror of this war made many to believe sincerely, earnestly, that this was a war to end all wars. Clearly, humanity has learned its lesson after the carnage of World War I. So went the sentiment of the time. So immediately following World War I, there was a tremendous sense of optimism. Democracy had defeated the Central Powers, and people hoped that a new settlement made in a democratic age might be reached by general agreement in an atmosphere of mutual confidence. There was a real sense of a new era upon people at this time. So having thrown out this guy right here, the Kaiser, and gotten rid of the warlords, the socialists and the Democrats, now ruling Germany after World War I, thought they would be treated by the victors with some moderation and consideration and respect. They felt a new democratic Germany would reemerge into its place in the world. So the Paris peace settlement was supposed to have been based on Wilson's 14 points. 27 nations assembled in Paris in January of 1919. France was the national choice because it had suffered the biggest losses. The vanquished nations, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria, were not accorded representation. This exclusion was against the spirit of Wilson's 14 points, and in many ways would lead directly to one of the major causes of World War II coming up in a generation from this peace conference. The major business matters were decided by conferences among the Big Four: Wilson, Lloyd George from England, Clemenceau of France, and Orlando from Italy. And it soon would become clear that despite Wilson's lofty ideals about what the world should look like post-World War I, it was clear he was going to lose control of this conference pretty quickly. The strongest personality of the conference was French Premier Clemenceau. So his burning ambition was to ensure the security of France for obvious reasons in the future. His formulation was reparations and guarantees. Clemenceau knew what he wanted. He stood on home ground and refused to budge from his bedrock demands, as he had seen 2 German invasions and did not want to see a third. So the order of business, the peace conference ended up being the League of Nations, what to do about the colonies, the Rhineland, and the Rhineland is this area, disputed area between Germany and France at this time, and so what to do about that, and then reparations, without regard to the people concerned. Democracy had defeated the Central Powers, and the people hoped that a new settlement made in a democratic age might be reached by general agreement in an atmosphere of mutual confidence. There was, again, there was this real sense of optimism, but this, as the peace conference went on, it was soon realized that this new era would be postponed for a while, to say the least. So the peace settlement that emerged from the peace conference at Paris is called the Peace of Paris. The individual treaties that constitute it bear the names of the small towns near Paris where they were signed. Dwarfing all others and often confused with the whole settlement was the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, but part of the Peace of Paris was the Treaty of St. Germain, the Treaty of Trianon, the Treaty of Services with Turkey, the Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria, and then finally the most famous one is the Treaty of Versailles with Germany. The Germans were simply handed the treaty on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. So, as discussed, Wilson compromised on all their parts of the peace settlement in order to get support for the League of Nations. To protect the Rhineland, the military terms of the treaty were severe. The Allies sought in all possible ways to prevent Germany from ever again becoming a major military power. Germany was forbidden to build offensive weapons. Buffer states were created and military occupation of the Rhineland established for 15 years. Thus, Wilson saw his plan for universal disarmament applied to Germany alone. The economic terms of the treaty were also severe. Germany lost all its colonies. All of the rich iron deposits of Lorraine were ceded to France. France also received economic control over the Saar coal fields, which were complementary to the Lorraine iron fields. However, administration control of the Saar Basin was given to the League of Nations. And probably the worst part of this treaty, which is really going to lead directly to World War II and lead to a strong nationalist like Hitler making a whole lot of sense to the German people, strong-arming his way into the world, back into the world stage, but were the reparations. The reparations basically stated that Germany would have to pay for everything. And there was no negotiation on that. And the Americans fiercely protested that, but in the end, Wilson and one and the same America lost out on that protest.